Hi everyone. So for this video, I want to talk a little bit about elections and voting. Specifically, I want to walk through some of the forms that some of our electoral processes take. Also going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the court cases and the way that court cases have sort of set particular conditions around how politics and money kind of intersect in the present day. But I want to start broadly by talking about um, the individual vote versus aggregate vote. This is another way of sort of posing a question. Does an individual's vote matter? Or another way to frame that question is voting a rational act? Um, the truth of the matter is that in most elections, an individual person's vote is almost never the deciding factor. Right? There are certainly elections in which margins are very, very close, but very rarely do elections come down to one and one vote only, making the difference between one candidate winning and the other. And as a result of this, a number of people sort of conclude that since their participation in an election doesn't really make a difference, they can find other things to do with their time. That since it doesn't matter, I'm not particularly incentivized to participate. And this is a problem with looking at voting as an individual action, right? Because if it's an individual action, then the rational choice would be to let other people do it, because voting takes time. Voting requires that you inform yourself, that you get to the polling place, that you do things to be able to exercise that right. And since it doesn't really matter whether you do or you don't, other things become more important. Other things end up taking your time. It's probably better, and I would certainly encourage people to think of voting as a collection action problem or a collective action problem, what we would call a social dilemma. A collective action problem is basically a situation in which all the individuals would be better off cooperating, but they fail to do so because of conflicting interests, like looking out for your own sort of rational self-interest. That discourages making engaging in joint action. So imagine 2/3 of an electorate saying my vote doesn't matter. At the individual level, that's probably true. But if 2/3 of an electorate all say that, then the 1/3 of the electorate that actually shows up to vote actually ends up wielding considerably more political power. Their preferences and choices become the outcome. And that may be at odds at the end of the day with what the other 2/3 of the electorate really wanted. So by thinking about voting and participating in elections as an individual level sort of consideration or phenomenon, people end up kind of shooting themselves in the foot. They end up working against their broad interests because, ironically, because they're pursuing what they see as their rational individual level interest. And it's that background, right, of voter apathy and relatively low turnout that I want to talk about elections and how elections work, right? That how does it come to pass that so many people see voting as something that really doesn't matter, or at least not to them, and that's really, really important. So when we look at voter turnout from 1960 all the way up through the 2020 election, generally speaking, we see a downward trend in participation, right? So over that period of time, so that would be what 60 years, right? So 60 years. So over that period of time, we've seen downward trends in both registration for voting when the eligible population is not actually registering to vote, but also in actually turning up at the polls and casting a ballot. So there are two kinds of elections where we can kind of see this pattern. Every 2 years, there is a congressional election, right? So every member of the House of Representatives, all 435 representatives, are up for re-election every 2 years. When those congressional elections align with a presidential election, right, we see voter turnout is higher, though slightly down from 1960 to the present, right? So in 4-year cycles, when we look at the presidential elections, we see that turnout is down slightly. When we look at what are called off-year congressional elections, which is a little bit of a misnomer because the on-year elections in which we're electing presidents are also congressional elections. But in off-year congressional elections, so the election that falls in between the 4-year cycle for electing presidents, voter registration and voter turnout are down significantly. Right, so significant declines in voter participation in the 2-year election cycles that don't coincide with the election of president, and of course slightly down in the years where presidents are on the ballot. The Senate is a little bit different. Senators serve 6-year terms, and if I recall correctly, every 2 years, a third of the Senate is up for either election or re-election, depending on whether the seat is open or whether they're challengers or if it's just an incumbent. But we have this system in place where senators serve 6-year terms, presidents serve 4-year terms, and members of the House of Representatives serve 2-year terms. And in all manner of elections, we see year after year or cycle after cycle or election after election that participation is dwindling. It's due to a number of different factors. There are registration barriers. Same-day registration states have higher turnout than states that have more restrictive rules governing voter registration. So we make it hard for people to register. We also make it sometimes hard for people to actually vote. We see some voter suppression efforts being engaged in a variety of places, usually under the guise of generating what are called, or addressing, I should say, what is called election security. So the idea is that we want to prevent voter fraud. Voter fraud is when somebody votes fraudulently. The actual number of incidents of voter fraud are incredibly small and very, very rare, and have never been shown to have been decisive in the outcome of an election. Electoral fraud is much, much higher. That means things like voter suppression, disenfranchisement, things like that. So that actually happens, and happens with sort of depressing regularity, and is actually consequential. But voter fraud itself is very, very rare. But the efforts that people propose as a way to address this relatively rare and ultimately inconsequential phenomenon have the effect of repressing particular groups of voters, mostly poor people, people of color, students, right? Some of these groups that show the highest level of apathy or the lowest rates of turnout often reflect the groups that are sort of targeted with those voter suppression efforts. So I would say barriers to registration, as well as voter suppression efforts under the guise of creating electoral security, right? The other reason why I think the decline is occurring, and it's not just me, I mean other social scientists as well, stems from a weak sense of what we call civil obligation, or civic, I shouldn't say, I meant civic obligation. Civic obligation is weak for 4 reasons in the United States. First, I would say that elements of U.S. culture, like individualism and privatism, weaken our sense of connection to others, right? We feel we are, and we see ourselves as a nation of individuals, which kind of undermines a collective sense of obligation. The second reason why civic obligation is pretty weak in the U.S. is that there's a constant attack on the role of government itself. this has the effect of sort of undermining confidence in and identification with the government. Ronald Reagan very famously back in the 80s said the scariest words in the English language were, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help," right? Explicitly running for the highest office in the country on a platform that government sucks and can't do anything right, right? So that was a little weird, but it worked, right? He won in 1980, and then he won a landslide election in 1984. In which he only lost one state. He won every other state in the country. And that message resonates with people. People have this strong sense that government is ineffective. Government is non-responsive. Government can't really do anything right. That's stoked and cultivated by the people who would really like to be able to engage in behaviors without any significant kind of accountability or government oversight. So not surprisingly, like the private sector is regularly pushing back against government regulation. And one way to make sure that regulations come off the books is to get an electorate who buy into this idea that the thing we need to do to get the country rolling is get government off the backs of corporations. But the sad truth is that corporations are far less accountable to everyday rank and file Americans than their government. But the perception is that government can't really do things nearly as well as the private sector. So we should align ourselves with the interests of and the aims and goals of the private sector. That's the second reason why civic obligation is really weak. The third is that high levels of inequality undercut both community and collective identity. It's really hard sometimes for people to feel like they're part of one big unified community or nation if we're sort of divided up amongst ourselves and sort of fighting each other. So you turn the middle class against the working class and the poor. You pit the working class and the poor against the middle class. You pit white working class voters against working class voters of color, right? You can imagine all of the scenarios in which sort of narrowly defined notions of identity and interest sort of undermine the ability to have a sense of collective identity and interest. And that works very, very well, of course, for the status quo and entrenched interests. And then the last reason why civic obligation is really weak is that money, of course, has saturated the political process, which has in turn eroded our trust in the system and made us very, very cynical about government and whether government can be a force for good in the lives of citizens. So these are kind of the headwinds that we move into as we try to find ways to get people engaged in a broad democratic endeavor in which the interests of the people collectively are reflected in the processes of decision making, but also in the outcomes that come out of that process. So I want to talk a little bit about how we do elections and how we kind of structure the electoral system. And I'll even suggest some potential alternatives just to make it abundantly clear that it doesn't have to be this way. That the system we have, as flawed as it is, and it certainly has its limitations and problems, is not necessarily a system that we're stuck with. Right? If people can correctly identify, remember the three things that we want to do whenever we turn our attention to understanding the society that we live in is we want accurate descriptions, we want clear explanations, and we want honest evaluations. We want to say, can it in fact be better? And if it can be better, how? How do we do that? So let's start with what we call the rules of the electoral game. There are three of them. There are what we call representation rules, there are electoral districts, and there's, of course, money and politics, the way in which the game is sort of shaped by money and politics. So we're going to start with representation rules. This is basically the set of rules that govern who votes for candidates, how the votes are counted, and how a winner is determined. This is probably what most people are familiar with when they go out and engage in politics, right? So as I I think I've mentioned before, for most people, politics consists of voting. Although that's obviously part of politics. Politics is certainly much more broad than that. But within the context of voting and participation in the electoral system, most people are probably somewhat familiar with the representation rules. We have what are called single member districts with plurality voting, which means that we have an electoral system in which a particular district, which is a geographic entity, a district has a single representative who wins election through a simple majority. So you could have a district that's 49% conservative and 51% progressive. The 51% support for the progressive candidate is going to produce a progressive representative for that district, even though the district is about half conservative, right? So you get right out of the gate a situation in which the representative of a particular district may not necessarily represent that district particularly well. We call this, by the way, you may sometimes hear people refer to something called first past the post, or FPP. That's basically the representation rule. The first person to get a majority of the votes is the winner. Most of the time. We'll talk a little bit about some of the problems with things like popular vote versus the Electoral College when it comes to presidential elections. But for representative districts, like the 435 districts that make up the U.S. House of Representatives, or the 100 seats that make up the U.S. Senate, winners are determined by a simple majority. So, what are the alternatives to this? Well, there are a lot, but three really prominent alternatives to first past the post voting would include things like fusion voting. Fusion voting is an arrangement where two or more political parties on a ballot list the same candidate. So somebody might run on the Democratic ticket, but they might also run on, say, the Working Families Party ticket. Or the green ticket or something like that. So what you end up doing effectively there is pooling the votes for a candidate, right? People who want to vote for the green candidate are also voting for the Democratic candidate. People who are voting for the Democratic candidate are also voting for the green candidate. Another alternative, and one that's actually starting to be tried in a number of different places around the United States, the New York mayoral election recently, and I believe Seattle mayoral election used this as well. But instant runoff voting. It's also called ranked choice voting. What this consists of is you're electing a single winner from a field of more than two candidates through ranking of those candidates. So let's say there are 5 candidates on a ballot, and you select your number 1 preference, you select your number 2 preference, your number 3 preference, your number 4 preference, and then your number 5 preference. If your first choice does not win a majority, then the votes that were to go to that candidate go to the second choice. Right, so imagine a presidential election in which Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, right? You might want to vote for Bernie Sanders because he aligns with your policy preferences, but you're worried that in a general election, he might not appeal to enough people to overcome the popularity of somebody like, say, Donald Trump. So you end up voting for Hillary Clinton. Well, with ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting, what you would do is you would vote for Bernie, and if Bernie doesn't win in the initial sort of count, then your vote goes to your second choice, which would presumably then be Hillary, and so it's safer for you to vote for a candidate that might not be necessarily considered a mainstream candidate with a good chance of winning. So a lot of people will vote for a candidate based on the idea that candidate can win, as opposed to voting for a candidate because that candidate reflects their interests or their policy preferences. So instant runoff voting basically replaces what used to happen, which is that if a candidate didn't get to a majority, then the two remaining candidates would be pitted against each other in what's called a runoff election. This is a runoff election without having to have the expense and difficulty of a second election. So it's instant runoff instead of a second election at a standalone second date. The third option is proportional representation, and this is an electoral system in which the divisions inside the electorate are going to be reflected proportionally in the elected body. So let's say that you have 100 people. 40 of those people identify themselves as Democrats. 40 of them identify themselves as Republicans. 10 of them identify themselves as Greens, and then 10 of them identify themselves as Libertarians. So everyone goes and they state their preference, and you have an elected representative body that's 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, 10% Green, 10% Libertarian, right? So in other words, all of the variability, or most of the variability in terms of political ideology within an electoral district, is reflected in the representative body. This is not anything that we do in the United States at the national or even at the state level, but it is something you see sometimes in parliamentary systems and other places around the world. So this is certainly an option that's out there, even if it's not one that we use. Okay, so that's the first set of rules, representation rules. The second set of rules in the electoral game revolve around what we call electoral districts. Now, these are the places that these representatives will represent when they go off to the state legislature or the federal government. These are distinct territorial subdivisions that hold separate elections for one or more seats in a legislative body. So, in the state of Illinois, we have electoral districts for federal government. So your representative in the House of Representatives is representing a distinct territorial subdivision. But you also have, in Springfield, you have state senators and you have state representatives. Those districts aren't identical to the districts that exist at the federal level, right? So when you go to vote, the candidates that appear on the ballot will be those who represent your address, right? Where you own your home or you rent your apartment. Each point on a map in a state falls within any number of different electoral districts, and the representatives in state government, the representatives sometimes in city government, right? Maybe you live in a ward or a precinct, right? You might have a representative at that level, much more granular and small. Now, what happens with electoral districts is that these are political constructs. In other words, the boundaries of these districts are drawn by representatives themselves. There are different rules that govern who draws the maps, but the maps, for example, for federal electoral districts are predicated on the census results. So every 10 years we have a decennial census. We count up the total number of people in the United States. We know that there are going to be 435 representatives in the U.S. House of Representatives. We want to make sure all the districts are roughly equal in size in terms of the total population. And so we draw boundaries to create similarly sized districts in terms of population. But we also draw the districts in a way that we are going to produce relatively predictable outcomes from the elections that will be held in those districts. And that process of drawing the maps in such a way that you get particular political advantages for one political party or another is called gerrymandering. So you've probably heard the term. You may even know quite a bit about it because every once in a while we actually have a conversation about gerrymandering. in this country, not as often as we need to, and it seems like actual solutions to the problems that gerrymandering creates um, um, sometimes don't present themselves, or we don't follow through on them. But if you look in the chapter, you'll see some very interesting examples of what gerrymandered districts look like and what kind of results come out of those. But in essence, a gerrymander is an attempt to establish a political advantage for a party or for a group by establishing a manipulated set of political boundaries for a district in which you get a particular outcome. What's happening here, in essence, is politicians are choosing their voters, which, when you think about it critically, is an inversion of what's supposed to happen, which is voters choose their representatives. But when the representatives are choosing their voters, then the outcome of the elections become foregone conclusions. Part of the reason why there's so much cynicism, right? That if the people in charge are drawing the maps, then big surprise, the people in charge are usually going to win the elections. A good example of this is seen in a Cornell study that was done in the wake of the 2012 elections in North Carolina. And I'll see if I can remember to post a summary of the study. But in North Carolina, in the 2012 election, a majority of the votes, right, in North Carolina were cast for Democratic Party candidates, right? So people who would represent North Carolina in the U.S. House of Representatives, the majority of those votes went to Democratic candidates. But 9 out of the 13 representatives in the North Carolina congressional delegation were Republicans, right? So the majority of the votes went to Democrats, but the overwhelming majority of representatives turned out to be Republicans, and that was because the way they drew the boundaries of the electoral districts, the concentration of Democratic votes in particular districts produced a couple of Democratic candidates, 4 to be exact. But the dilution, right, the diminution of the weight of Republican or Democratic votes in other parts of the state ended up producing Republican representatives from those districts. So this particular example of gerrymandering is an illustration of 2 processes we call packing and cracking. So packing is when you draw a boundary for a district so that you're concentrating the votes of an opposition party, right? So we're the Republicans, and we're drawing the North Carolina maps because the Republicans are in charge of the North Carolina state legislature, which is where these maps originate, usually in state legislatures. So the Republicans are in charge of drawing the maps. So they're going to draw the maps in such a way as they're going to maximize the number of Republican representatives. Now, you can't, in a state where over half the votes are going to go to Democrats, you can't avoid having some Democrats in your congressional delegation. But what you do then is you find the Democrats where they live, and it's typically urban and near suburban areas around bigger cities, and you draw the boundaries of a map in such a way that you're capturing all of those Democratic voters and you're concentrating them in that particular district. You're packing them into that district. And, the Democratic candidate is going to win that district, by huge majorities, because basically all the voters in that district are Democratic voters. But then you get outside of those districts, and even though you may have 2 parts of a city, or you may have a city and a very, very close suburb, if that suburb is mostly Republican, then by cutting it off from the body of Democratic voters, you're going to be more likely to be able to elect a Republican to represent that district. And in that instance, what you're doing is you're cracking, you're splitting the opposition support into 2 or more districts so that the support for your opposition party kind of gets weakened, right? So packing and cracking are basically the 2 kinds of outcomes that are produced by this gerrymandering process. One very interesting development is that states are starting to push for what are called nonpartisan redistricting commissions, right? So bodies that are supposed to draw in the wake of census results every 10 years, are supposed to draw new districts based on nonpartisan principles. So putting districts together that reflect maybe the geographical realities of a community or a city and suburbs, rather than sort of drawing these kind of haphazard lines to kind of create pools of, say, for example, people with shared ethnicity or race or social class, or political ideology. The Supreme Court recently has weighed in on the issue of gerrymandering and said racial gerrymandering is, still something that is prohibited. Give them time, I think, but political or partisan gerrymandering is not prohibited. And so states where, like North Carolina, where there is a majority of voters who express a preference for Democratic representation, might still end up with a majority of their delegation being made up of Republicans, because, again, it is not prohibited by law to draw those districts in that way. All right, so that's the second set of conditions or things that shape the rules of the electoral game. The last is money in politics. And money in politics is mostly going to take the form of what we call lobbying. There are other ways in which money can influence politics: advertising, certainly setting electoral policies reflect the efforts of politicians going out there and chasing campaign contributions. But lobbying is kind of the elephant in the room. Lobbying is an act of attempting to influence decision makers in government through the use of things like votes or campaign contributions or other forms of political compensation. The people who are being lobbied typically are going to be either legislators or regulatory agencies. So sometimes lobbyists will work to influence the way in which a regulatory agency does its regulating. Sometimes they'll go directly to legislators and lobby them to pass laws or to overturn or to resist laws that work against their interests. And lobbying is something that everybody gets to do. It is a constitutionally protected activity. It's enshrined in the First Amendment. The right to petition your government for a redress of grievances is what lobbying is. That is the essence and soul of it. But what's happened over the last 130 plus years is that the influence of money in politics, the influence of money specifically as a force that's used in the lobbying process, has changed, and the deck has kind of been stacked in favor of people who have a lot of money to exert political influence, which works to the detriment of people who don't have those financial resources at their disposal. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of Supreme Court cases that kind of establish the present day role of money in politics. And I want to go back to the 14th Amendment first, 1868. Because a lot of the justification for the changes in electoral policy when it comes to the role of money in politics is predicated on some stuff that comes out of the 14th Amendment. So in the 14th Amendment, one of the things that happens is that all people who are born or naturalized in the United States are considered citizens of the United States. Remember, this is in the wake of the Civil War. We have all of these slaves who have now been freed, but these slaves are not yet American citizens. This 14th Amendment comes along and says if you were born here or if you're naturalized here, then you are automatically citizens. That takes care of turning all of these slaves from slaves into citizens now. And one of the things that you find in the 14th Amendment is something called the Equal Protection Clause, which says that all citizens, all persons, are are entitled to constitutional rights. They're entitled to due process under the law. That's the language of the clause. So basically, the 14th Amendment grants the rights of citizens to former slaves, but the language is written in such a way that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. And the amendment does not define persons, which becomes something that gets exploited a little bit later. Specifically, in 1886, in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad is a Supreme Court decision in which the justices kind of ended up agreeing that the Equal Protection Clause applies to corporations. So in other words, corporations are people. Now, corporations are legal entities, right? They are the Latin root means body. Corpse and corporation have the same root word. If you stop and think about it, that's actually a little funny. But the idea here is that there were people who were pushing for interpretations of the law to say that persons included corporations, legal entities, legal persons, and not just flesh and blood living human being persons. So this case, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, establishes in a way that's a little bit hinky, but when you read the Tom Hartman piece, you'll see what he's sort of saying about this. But regardless, it does establish a precedent, and there's this concept that's used in jurisprudence called stare decisis. And stare decisis, it looks like it's spelled stare, S-T-A-R-E, but it's pronounced stare for whatever reason. Stare decisis is basically just the way in which the Supreme Court will lean on what's called precedent, right? What decisions have we made before that are like the one that is in front of us now? And we're going to basically use that established principle or that precedent to inform our current decision. So once corporations are seen as persons, then it becomes a relatively easy thing to imagine that over time, all of the rights that apply to persons, living, breathing human organisms, would also have to apply to these legal constructs called corporations. So that's what happens with Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. 1976, we get a court case called Buckley v. Valeo. Now, in Buckley v. Valeo, using First Amendment arguments, right? Because remember, corporations are people. They get First Amendment rights just like other people. So under First Amendment arguments, Buckley v. Valeo sort of strikes down limits on spending in campaigns. But it does uphold a limit on individual contributions. Essentially, what this case argues is money is speech, and as speech, it can't be significantly limited. It's still being limited in some ways, but we're beginning to see kind of the opening of a door or the beginning of a slippery slope here. The money is speech, and because it's speech, you can't really significantly limit it. Then we get, in 2010, Citizens United versus the FEC. FEC just means Federal Elections Commission. Citizens United, Not Timid, was an organization that created a documentary about Hillary Clinton, and the FEC sort of took issue with the certain aspects of their political activity and said this is actually prohibited under some of the rules that govern how money operates in politics. The John Roberts Court, right? So John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, so we call it the Roberts Court. The courts are always identified by the Chief Justice. So the Roberts Court required the plaintiffs in this case, Citizens United, to resubmit their complaint to the U.S. Supreme Court so that the Supreme Court could make a much broader ruling. This is kind of him putting his thumbs on the scale and saying, I want to say something about money in politics. This case, as you submitted it to us, doesn't really let me do exactly what I want to do, so resubmit it. He's He's a guy who talks a lot about sort of a nonpartisan, I'm just calling balls and strikes kind of thing. But he is a political actor. There's a lot of debate about whether the U.S. Supreme Court is neutral or a political body. It's absolutely a political body, but that it tries to sort of dress itself up as just, we're just the arbiters of the law. But this is an inherently political process, and sometimes the people who are playing the game sort of tip their hat a little bit. And I think that this is one of those places where that happened. But anyway, so in the resubmitted complaint from Citizens United, the plaintiff in this case, the Roberts Court went on to issue a majority opinion that said there are no limits on independent political expenditures by nonprofit corporations. Now, you don't really need to know all of that inside baseball stuff, right? But basically what you do need to know is that Citizens United established that corporations are people and they have the same rights as living, breathing organisms. Now, like I said, after Santa Clara, everything seemed to be moving in that direction anyway, but in 2010, it kind of becomes official. That is the direct line implication of the Citizens United versus FEC decision, is that corporations are people and they have the same rights as people: speech rights, rights against search and seizure, rights against rights to lobby, rights to to bear arms, all kinds of different rights that apply to individual living, breathing organisms. Also now, without any sort of reservation, also apply now to these corporate entities. The next year, we get another really important case, which is McComish v. Bennett. What this decision does is it strikes down Arizona's Clean Elections Act. So in the first decade of the 21st century, so after 2000, Arizona started putting together what they called their Clean Elections Act, and a lot of stuff in there. It covered a lot of things, but one of the things that it did was it tried to create level playing fields when it came to campaign funding. So if I'm a millionaire and I can spend, as much of my money as I want on an election, and I'm going up against somebody who is, like a bus driver or a school teacher or somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, I'm going to automatically have an advantage because I can secure, billboards and flyers and advertising time on local television and radio. In other words, I can get my message and my candidacy out there to a wider audience that this other person doesn't have the financial resources to do. Even before we start to get contributions from other people, I'm already at a competitive advantage. So what the Clean Elections Act did, among other things, was it created a public funding mechanism in which, let's say one candidate has $500,000 on hand and the other person has $1 million on hand. Money would go to this person who has $500,000 on hand to try to level the funding that's available, the financial resources that are available to the parties in this election. The Supreme Court says, nope, you can't do that. It is unconstitutional to use public money to basically support candidates. So you can see the way the deck is being stacked in favor of candidates who can self-fund over those who have, if all candidates are self-funding, then the ones who have a lot of money are going to be at an advantage over the ones who do not have a lot of money. And then a few years later in 2014, we get another Supreme Court case that involves the Federal Elections Commission. This one's called McCutcheon versus FEC. And what this one does is it basically almost completely deregulates political campaigns. It invalidates the individual aggregate contribution limits. What that means is that you can spend as much money as you want in political campaigns. You still can't contribute more than a certain amount of money directly to an individual campaign, but you could max out your individual contribution to Donald Trump, but then you could also make unlimited contributions to any political action committees that will promote his candidacy or the issues that are central to his candidacy. So it essentially allows for unlimited funding of campaigns, not necessarily directly, but certainly in a more indirect fashion. So McCutcheon v. FEC is one more way in which U.S. jurisprudence, when it comes to election law, is increasingly leaning toward empowering the people with the greatest amount of money, right? So people with the greatest amount of money increasingly have the ability to exercise significant influence over elections and the way in which elections operate. You can kind of see it, in state elections as well, where a candidate might get the financial backing of a wealthy benefactor, right? So the wealthy benefactor probably isn't going to be appealing to the rank and file voters, or maybe doesn't even live in the state or the district where the candidate does. So like in the 2022 elections, we're seeing a Senate candidate in Ohio, a guy named J.D. Vance, who's an author, wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy that you may have heard of, got made into a movie. So the guy's nominally a little bit of a celebrity candidate. He has a significant amount of backing from a guy named Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel does not live in Ohio, but he really, really, really wants to see J.D. Vance get elected to the U.S. Senate. And so he's providing a significant amount of financial resources to J.D. Vance's campaign, both directly and indirectly. And these Supreme Court decisions that have kind of come before have made it very, very easy for that to happen. And again, this contributes to, I think, a deep cynicism that most voters have with regard to whether or not their vote is going to matter, right? The idea is that if, all of these candidates can basically tap into and spend in unlimited ways the money that's available to them from campaign contributions, from corporate interests, from all of these other bodies, what chance do we have to get somebody who's genuinely representing everyday citizens? And that's a legit concern. I would point out that at the end of the day, in Ohio, Peter Thiel doesn't have a single vote. He's got a lot of money, but he doesn't actually have the ability to go in and cast a vote for J.D. Vance. Right? Citizens of the state of Ohio have the right to vote for or against J.D. Vance, but his wealthy benefactor does not. So in a democracy, even with all of the odds kind of stacked against against average everyday citizens, it is still the case that the vast majority of political power, even in the context of elections, resides in the hands of the mass of people who make up the society. And again, can't be overstated enough. This is just electoral politics. Politics more broadly includes things like demonstrations. It includes things like petitions and lobbying. It includes, imagine a one-day mass strike, right? Imagine everybody in the United States stops working for a day. If we could get the vast majority of everyday working Americans to stop working for a day, the message that sends to corporations, the message that sends to politicians, the message that sends to all of these powerful interests is that we're indispensable, right? And there's a lot of power in a group of people who are indispensable. The trick, of course, is getting them to see that they are indispensable, getting them to see that they actually have a significant amount of power. That's how political change occurs. It's usually not done through elections and electoral processes. It's done through a broader kind of civic engagement. So we have to be sort of mindful of the ways in which attacks on the idea that the state or the idea that the public can actually exert political power and try to influence things is not some pie in the sky crazy idea. It's actually very consistent with democratic principles and the idea that in a society of equal citizens, people have a collective right to sort of determine what their society looks like and how it works. So elections are very important. I don't want to downplay them. I think that they're critical, but I think the problem is that for a lot of people, their notion of politics begins and ends at their participation in elections. And far too often, it's the presidential cycle and not the off-year congressional elections. But if elections matter, then they all matter, and certainly people should be more engaged in them. As a starting point, right? And then, obviously developing a broader, more civically engaged notion of politics becomes important as well. And that's something we're going to talk about in subsequent videos. So until then, I'll say good night.